The U.S. and the Philippines really has an interesting and complicated history. Uh, the involvement of the U.S., the influences of culture and so forth, cultural exchanges, really didn't begin until 1898 with the invasion, and really a very difficult period followed. But in World War II, there was a really interesting thing that happened. Okay, the U.S. and Filipinos were fighting the Japanese. And the death march happened when so many thousands of Americans and Filipinos surrendered. They really caught the Japanese flat-footed. The Japanese had only anticipated a few thousand prisoners. There's more than 20, and they didn't have transportation, forced them to walk and so forth. The death march and all that. Uh, but here's something interesting. Okay, when the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, which is now Malaysia, okay, Indonesia, uh, the Indonesian people helped the Japanese track down and find all the Dutch that tried to evade, avoid arrest, capture, internment, whatever. Suharto, one of the Indonesia's presidents, has a speech online. You can look it up, where he's crediting Japan with the freedom of his country, freedom from uh, being a colony of the Netherlands. Now, it's really interesting how there's just a friction between the Dutch and Indonesia, but in the Philippines, the people really still embrace Americans, and it's just something that's pervasive. You see it everywhere. People wearing basketball jerseys of American basketball teams, people wearing shirts with the American flag on it. I see that more here than I do in the U.S. Jeepneys with the San Diego Padres logo on it, a baseball team in the U.S. It just goes on and on and on. But it's not one-sided. It's not Filipinos that love the U.S. There's Americans that just fall in love with the Philippines. And it's really odd. Americans come here and they just don't want to leave. I ran into one of these people at Starbucks fairly recently. I was talking to him and I explained to him how we still have an apartment in Texas and I go back and forth keeping things up over there. And he was shaking his head, staring at me in amazement, and he just said, I don't want to go back. I don't ever want to go back to the U.S. He wants to stay in the Philippines forever, and I'm sure he will. But this goes back. This isn't a recent thing. During World War II, there was a book that I read from some of the survivors of this. Americans were captured not only in Bataan, the death march and all that, but Americans were captured all over the Philippines. So there were American bases in Cebu, in Mindanao, and some of those soldiers that were captured in Mindanao escaped and managed to make it to the U.S. They managed to signal a submarine. There were Filipino guerrillas still fighting the war, fighting the Japanese. A lot of those guerrillas had American I guess what you would say now American commandos. At the time they were just advisors, I guess, American soldiers working with them, gathering intelligence and whatnot. And some of these escapees made it to some of these Filipino guerrilla groups. They were able to contact the American military, who sent a submarine and whisked these guys back to the U.S. to safety. Well, one of these guys wrote a book about his whole adventure there. And the interesting thing in this book is, when they're in the jungles in Mindanao, trying to avoid the main roads, because the Japanese all travel along these roads, trying to avoid the cities, because a lot of the Filipinos kind of embraced the Japanese and worked with them. And you had to avoid specific areas, and so sometimes they just traveled through the jungle. And they're traveling through the jungle in between these little villages that they went to. And these Americans, with these Filipino guerrillas guiding them, heard somebody shouting out, "Hey Joe, hey Joe." And they were surprised, and they realized that it's an American. It's an American, I forget his accent, if it was New York accent or what. But it was this older guy who was living with two women in the jungle. He had a little cabin set up. And the author of the book, one of these escaped soldiers, was theorizing that he thinks this guy probably was wanted in the U.S. for some kind of crime, and he just decided, I'm going to take a pile of money and just go to the Philippines and disappear, and that's exactly what he did. And he didn't want rescue. He didn't want the American soldiers to, try to get some kind of pardon for him or something. I'll help you guys out if you help me get back to the U.S. or anything like that. No, forget it. He was happy. He wanted to stay, and he did. I'm sure he stayed. Had a happy life. But that's somebody who left the U.S. probably in the 1930s and fell in love with the Philippines and stayed. So this is something that goes back. It's really interesting. There's a kind of a harmony somehow between American personalities and Filipinos. And it goes both ways. The Filipinos love going to the U.S. There were 25,000 Filipinos living within a 1-hour drive of where we lived in Texas. And here, I keep running into Americans everywhere. I get a little bit tired of it sometimes. Sometimes an American approaches me and I have to tell him, okay, nice seeing you. I'll talk to you later. I really don't want to be surrounded by Americans, all the time. I just like focusing on my kids, raising my kids and seeing that they're surrounded by good people. And the best people I know here are my wife's family. So I'm happy here. I fell in love with things here. And it's just fascinating to know that so many Americans have had the same experience. One of the largest cemeteries, I think it might be the largest cemetery outside the U.S. of American soldiers, is here in Manila. And that's because so many Americans died here during World War II, and the family said, no, instead of bringing them back and having them buried at Arlington, it's okay. I feel good that they're buried with their mates, their comrades, their friends. And so they remained. There's a huge cemetery here of thousands of Americans that are still buried here, that are still here. One of those people that's buried here is my wife's cousin. My wife's cousin died in the war. Super good-looking guy. And it's interesting. It's interesting. There's a real parallel. And I can't really find a really good reason why there was so much friction between the Indonesian and the Dutch. And there's so much affection between Filipinos and Americans. The U.S. is really similar to the Netherlands. You can take somebody from the Netherlands, a Dutch person, and bring them to the U.S., and it's hard to identify them. It's a Protestant culture. It's Northern European. The U.S. is also, the U.S. of course is a mixture of all kinds of ethnic groups and different races and so forth. But there's an awful lot of people in the U.S. that look like people from the Netherlands. And the U.S. is a predominantly Protestant Christian nation, like the Netherlands. So there's all these parallels between the U.S. and the Netherlands. Now, Indonesia and the Philippines, it's all the same people. They're different cultures now because the Philippines has had 300 years of Spanish influences, but there's still an awful lot of similarities. You really can't eliminate all those genetic similarities that Filipinos have with Malaysians and Indonesians. It's really interesting, but somehow the relationship is just the exact opposite. Indonesians with the Dutch and Filipinos with Americans. It's really interesting. Well, just my thoughts. Hope you're having a good day. Take care.